August 19, 1981. The humidity hung thick over Laurel County, Kentucky. Like a wool blanket, someone forgot to take off the line. At the Blue Lantern Diner on Highway 25, the last customers were finishing their coffee and peach pie, while outside, the first rumbles of thunder rolled across the hills like freight trains in the distance. Emily Rhodes wiped down table 7 for the third time that evening, her red uniform sticking to her back in the oppressive heat. 27 years old, with auburn hair she kept pinned back during her shifts, Emily had been working at the Blue Lantern for nearly 4 years. She knew every regular customer by name, remembered how they liked their eggs, and could spot trouble walking through the door from 50 yards away. The diner itself was a slice of Americana that time seemed to have forgotten. Red vinyl booths with silver trim, a jukebox that still played Patsy Cline for a quarter, and a neon sign outside that buzzed and flickered whenever the weather turned. The Blue Lantern was more than just a restaurant. It was the heartbeat of this small Kentucky community, a place where shift workers grabbed coffee at 5 in the morning, and teenagers came to share milkshakes on Friday nights. Emily's manager, Frank Morrison, was counting the till behind the counter, his thick fingers moving slowly through the worn bills. Frank had owned the Blue Lantern since 1967, and in all those years, he'd never had an employee more reliable than Emily. She showed up on time, stayed late when needed, and had a smile that could turn even the grumpiest trucker into a regular customer. "You don't have to stay for cleanup tonight," Frank called out, glancing at the darkening sky through the front windows. "Storm's coming in heavy. Better get home before it hits." Emily looked up from the table she was cleaning, her green eyes reflecting the soft glow of the overhead lights. "You sure, Frank? I don't mind staying. Besides, you know how I drive in weather like this, like my grandmother taught me. Slow and steady." Frank chuckled, but there was genuine concern in his voice. "I'm sure. Alice called earlier, looking for you anyway. Said it was important." The mention of Alice McKinney made Emily pause. Alice had been her best friend since high school, the kind of friend who knew all your secrets and never judged you for them. But lately, things had been strained between them. There had been argument, whispered conversations that stopped when others came near, and a tension that Emily couldn't quite understand. "Did she say what it was about?" Emily asked, hanging up her apron on the hook behind the counter. "No, just that she needed to talk to you. You know, Alice, everything's dramatic with that girl." Emily smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. She gathered her purse, a small brown leather bag that had belonged to her mother, and checked inside for her car keys. The familiar weight of them in her palm was reassuring her. 1973 Ford Galaxy that her father had helped her buy when she graduated from high school. It wasn't much to look at, with its faded blue paint and a dent in the rear bumper from a parking lot mishap, but it was hers. The first fat raindrops were hitting the diner's windows as Emily said "Good night" to Frank and pushed through the glass door. The parking lot was nearly empty, except for her Galaxy and Frank's old pickup truck. In the distance, she could see the headlights of cars moving along the highway, people hurrying to get home before the storm hit in earnest. As she walked toward her car, Emily noticed something that made her pause. Parked at the far edge of the lot, barely visible in the shadow of an old oak tree, was a blue pickup truck she didn't recognize. It wasn't uncommon for strangers to stop at the Blue Lantern. The diner was right off the highway, and travelers often needed a hot meal and directions. But something about this truck felt different. The driver was still inside, just sitting there. And even though Emily couldn't make out any details in the dim light, she had the uncomfortable feeling that whoever it was had been watching the diner. She shook off the feeling and unlocked her car door. The interior was still warm from the day's heat, and the vinyl seat stuck to her legs as she slid behind the wheel. The radio crackled to life when she turned the key, and Dolly Parton's voice filled the car, singing about working 9 to 5. Emily smiled despite her unease and backed out of the parking space. As she pulled onto Highway 25, heading toward Old Timber Road that would take her home to her small apartment on Maple Street, Emily glanced in her rearview mirror. The blue pickup was still sitting in the parking lot, motionless as a sleeping giant. She pressed the accelerator a little harder and focused on the road ahead. Old Timber Road was exactly what its name suggested, a winding, tree-lined route that cut through some of the most beautiful countryside in Kentucky. During the day, it was a scenic drive past tobacco fields and old farmhouses with wraparound but at night, especially with a storm approaching, the road could feel isolated and foreboding. The tall trees on either side created a canopy so thick that streetlights were sparse, leaving long stretches of darkness between the scattered farms. Emily had driven this route hundreds of times. She knew every curve, every pothole, every place where deer might dart across the road. Tonight, though, with the thunder getting louder and the first real drops of rain beginning to spatter her windshield, the familiar journey felt different. She was about 5 miles down Old Timber Road when she noticed the headlights in her rear-view mirror. They appeared suddenly, bright and close, as if another vehicle had been traveling without lights and had just turned them on. Emily frowned and adjusted her mirror, trying to get a better look at the vehicle behind her. But the headlights were too bright and too close. The rain was coming down harder now, and Emily turned on her windshield wipers. The rhythmic swishing sound was almost hypnotic, and she found herself thinking about Alice's phone call. What could be so important that it couldn't wait until tomorrow? They had planned to meet for lunch on Saturday anyway, at the little cafe downtown, where they always went to catch up on gossip and talk about their dreams of leaving Laurel County for something bigger. The headlights behind her were getting closer. Emily glanced at her speedometer. She was doing 35, which was appropriate for the wet conditions and winding road. Whoever was behind her was either in a hurry or didn't know how dangerous Old Timber Road could be in weather like this. She slowed down slightly and moved as far to the right as she safely could, hoping the other driver would pass her. But, instead of going round, the vehicle behind her slowed down too, maintaining the same uncomfortably close distance. Emily's heart began to beat a little faster. This wasn't normal driving behavior, especially not on a night like this. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the road ahead for a brief moment. In that instant, Emily could see the creek that ran parallel to Old Timber Road, its banks swollen with the day's rain and the storm that was just beginning. She had always loved the creek as a child. She and her friends would come here in the summer to catch crawfish and skip stones. Now, in the darkness and rain, it looked dark and threatening. Another flash of lightning, and this time Emily caught a glimpse of the vehicle behind her in her side mirror. It was the blue pickup truck from the diner parking lot. She was sure of it now. The same boxy shape, the same height. Whoever had been sitting in that truck, watching the blue lantern, was now following her down Old Timber Road. Emily's hands tightened on the steering wheel. She told herself not to panic, that there could be a perfectly innocent explanation. Maybe the driver lived somewhere along this route, and had just happened to leave the diner at the same time she did. Maybe he was lost, and hoping she would lead him to a main road. Maybe she was letting her imagination run away with her on a dark, stormy night. But deep in her gut, Emily Rhodes knew that something was wrong, very wrong. The speedometer needle was hovering around 30 when Emily made a decision. Just ahead was a sharp curve that she knew well, a bend in the road where the creek came closest to the asphalt. If she could navigate that curve quickly and safely, she might be able to put some distance between herself and the pickup truck. At the very least, she would be able to see if the driver was really following her or just happened to be going in the same direction. She pressed the gas pedal and felt the Galaxy respond. The big Ford had plenty of power when she needed it, and tonight, she needed it. The headlights behind her immediately got brighter as the pickup truck sped up to match her pace. Emily's heart was racing now. This was definitely not a coincidence. Someone was following her, and on a deserted road in the middle of a thunderstorm, that could only mean trouble. She thought about turning round and driving back to the Blue Lantern, where Frank would still be closing up and could help her. But that would mean passing the pickup truck, and she wasn't sure she wanted to get that close to whoever was driving it. Instead, she decided to try to make it home. Her apartment was still several miles away, but it was in town where there would be other people, streetlights, and safety. If she could just outrun this truck for a few more minutes, she would be okay. The rain was coming down in sheets now, and Emily's windshield wipers were struggling to keep up. She had to lean forward to see the road clearly, her face just inches from the steering wheel. The yellow center line was barely visible through the downpour, and the headlights behind her created a glare that made it even harder to navigate. Lightning struck somewhere close by, the thunder following almost immediately. The storm was right on top of them now, and Emily could hear the rain pounding on the roof of her car like 1,000 tiny hammers. She was approaching the sharpest curve on Old Timber Road, a 90-degree turn that followed the natural bend of the creek. Even in good weather, this was a spot where drivers had to slow down. Emily began to brake gently, feeling the wet road surface beneath her tires. The pickup truck behind her was still there, its headlights filling her rearview mirror with white light. As she entered the curve, Emily glanced at her speedometer one last time. 25 miles per hour. A safe speed for the conditions and the turn ahead. That was the last clear thought Emily Rhodes would ever have. What happened next would become the subject of speculation, investigation, and whispered conversations for decades to come. The official police report would list it as a single vehicle accident, cause unknown. But the people of Laurel County would never be satisfied with that explanation. They would remember the blue pickup truck that nobody could identify, the missing purse and shoes, the strange inconsistencies that never quite added up. Most of all, they would remember Emily Rhodes herself, the young woman with the warm smile and the auburn hair, who simply vanished on a stormy night in August, leaving behind only questions that would haunt the hills of Kentucky for the rest of their lives. At dawn on August 20th, 1981, Farmer John Whitfield was checking on his cattle when he saw something glinting in the morning light near Mill Creek. Emily's 1973 Ford Galaxy sat half-submerged in the shallow water, its headlights still glowing weakly in the grey morning mist. But Emily Rhodes was nowhere to be found. John Whitfield had been farming the same 100 acres along Mill Creek for 37 years. He knew every inch of his land, every seasonal change in the water level, every sound that belonged and every sound that didn't. So when he stepped out of his farmhouse at 5:30 on the morning of August 20th to check on his cattle before the day got too hot, he immediately knew something was wrong. The storm had passed during the night, leaving the air clean and cool for the first time in weeks. Steam rose from the wet earth like ghosts, and the creek that bordered his property was running higher and faster than usual. But there, where the water made a gentle bend near his fence line, something metallic caught the early morning light. John squinted through the mist and felt his stomach drop. A Cara blue Ford Galaxy sat nose down in the creek, its rear wheels still on the muddy bank. The headlights were on, casting pale yellow circles into the dark water, and the driver's side door hung open like a broken wing. "Jesus Christ," John muttered, and started running toward the creek as fast as his 63-year-old legs could carry him. By the time he reached the car, John was breathing hard, and his boots were caked with mud. The Galaxy had come to rest at an odd angle, as if it had simply rolled off the road and into the water without any attempt to brake or steer. There were no skid marks visible on old timber road above, no torn earth or broken vegetation to suggest the car had crashed through anything. Most unsettling of all, there was no sign of the driver. John waded into the knee-deep water and peered through the open door. The interior was soaked, and a woman's red uniform hung from the back of the passenger seat like a discarded skin. The radio was still playing softly some early morning farm report about corn prices and weather forecasts. The keys dangled from the ignition, and a cup of coffee from the Blue Lantern diner sat in the cup holder, its contents diluted by rainwater. But no driver, no body, no sign of what had happened to whoever had been behind the wheel when this car left the road. John Whitfield had seen enough accidents in his lifetime to know that this wasn't right. Cars didn't just roll into creeks by themselves, and people didn't vanish into thin air. He backed out of the water and climbed up the muddy bank to Old Timber Road, searching for any clue that might explain what he was looking at. The asphalt was still wet from the storm, making it impossible to see tire tracks or other evidence. But as John walked along the edge of the road, something caught his eye. About 20 feet from where the car had gone into the creek, a woman's high-heeled shoe lay in the grass, its black leather scuffed and muddy. Just one shoe, no sign of the other. John picked up the shoe and turned it over in his hands. Size 7, he guessed, well-worn but cared for. The kind of shoe a waitress might wear to work, practical but feminine. He looked around for its mate, but found nothing except wet grass and the lingering smell of rain. 15 minutes later, John was on the phone with the Laurel County Sheriff's Department, his voice shaky as he tried to explain what he'd found. Within an hour, Old Timber Road was blocked off with yellow tape, and half the county's law enforcement was standing around Emily Rhodes' submerged Ford Galaxy, scratching their heads and asking the same questions John had been asking himself. Sheriff Bobby Ray Hudson arrived at the scene at 7:15, driving his brown and tan cruiser with the kind of urgency reserved for situations that might make the evening news. Bobby Ray had been sheriff for 12 years, elected on a platform of keeping Laurel County safe from the kind of troubles that plagued bigger cities. A missing person case, especially one involving a well-liked young woman like Emily Rhodes, was exactly the kind of trouble he'd hoped to avoid. "What do we know for sure?" Bobby Ray asked Deputy Raymond Hurst as they stood on the creek bank, watching the volunteer fire department prepare to winch Emily's car out of the water. Raymond consulted his notebook, a habit he'd developed during his 2 years as a deputy. Car belongs to Emily Rhodes, 27, works at the Blue Lantern Diner. She left work around 9:30 last night, according to her boss. Car was discovered this morning by the property owner. No sign of the driver, any indication of what caused her to leave the road. That's the strange part, Sheriff. No skid marks, no evidence of braking or swerving. Car's got some front-end damage from hitting the creek bed, but nothing that suggests a high-speed crash. Almost like she just drove off the road. Bobby Ray frowned and walked closer to the water's edge. The Ford was being pulled slowly from the creek now, water pouring from its open doors and broken windows. As it emerged fully, the damage became more apparent. The front bumper was dented, and the grille was cracked, but these looked like impact damage from hitting the rocks in the creek bed. There was no evidence of another vehicle, no paint scrapes, no broken glass that might indicate a collision. "We found this," Raymond said, holding up the black high-heeled shoe that John Whitfield had discovered. "Just the one. Been looking for the other one, but no luck so far." Bobby Ray took the shoe and examined it carefully. The leather was scuffed and water-stained, but it wasn't damaged in a way that suggested trauma or violence. It looked like it had simply fallen off someone's foot. "Any word from her family, friends?" I called the address on her driver's registration. "Lives alone in an apartment on Maple Street. Landlady hasn't seen her since yesterday afternoon. I'm heading over to talk to her friend Alice McKinney next. Apparently they were supposed to meet up yesterday evening." The sheriff nodded and watched as Emily's car was finally pulled completely out of the water and loaded onto a flatbed truck. The interior was a soggy mess of personal belongings, work uniform, a paperback romance novel, a small makeup compact, and various other items that painted a picture of a normal young woman living a normal life. But no purse, no wallet, and no sign of Emily herself. "Treat this as a missing person case for now," Bobby Ray told Raymond, "but keep your eyes open for anything that doesn't add up. Something about this whole situation feels off to me." By noon, word of Emily's disappearance had spread through Laurel County like smoke from a grass fire. The Blue Lantern Diner was packed with customers who claimed they needed coffee, but really wanted to hear Frank Morrison tell the story of Emily's last shift, over and over again. The local radio station interrupted its regular programming every hour with updates, though there wasn't much new information to share. Deputy Raymond Hurst found Alice McKinney at her job at the Laurel County Library, reshelving books with the kind of mechanical precision that suggested her mind was elsewhere. Alice was 26, a year younger than Emily, with brown hair that she wore in a practical bob, and glasses that made her look more serious than she actually was. She and Emily had been inseparable since high school, the kind of friends who finished each other's sentences and shared each other's secrets. "Alice, I'm Deputy Hurst with the Sheriff's Department. I need to ask you some questions about Emily Rhodes." Alice looked up from the cart of books she was organizing, and Raymond could see immediately that she'd been crying. Her eyes were red and puffy, and her hands shook slightly as she set down the book she was holding. "Is it true about her car being found in the creek?" "I'm afraid so. When did you last speak with Emily?" Alice glanced around the library, making sure they weren't being overheard, then led Raymond to a quiet corner near the reference section. "Yesterday afternoon. I called her at the diner around 4 o'clock. What did you talk about?" Alice hesitated, and Raymond got the distinct impression that she was choosing her words carefully. "Just ... things. We were supposed to meet for lunch on Saturday. I wanted to confirm the time. That's all. Frank Morrison said you told him it was important." The color drained from Alice's face, and she sat down heavily in one of the library chairs. We ... We had a disagreement about something personal. I wanted to apologize, to make things right between us." "What kind of disagreement?" "It's complicated. Emily had been seeing someone, and I didn't approve. I said some things I shouldn't have said, and she got angry with me. We hadn't really talked in almost a week." Raymond made notes in his pad, but something about Alice's story didn't ring true. The details were too vague, too carefully constructed. "Who was Emily seeing?" "I don't know his name. She was very secretive about it. Said it was complicated, that people wouldn't understand if they knew." "Married man?" "Maybe. Or maybe someone from out of town. Emily liked her privacy when it came to relationships. She said this one was different, that it might actually go somewhere serious." Raymond studied Alice's face, looking for signs of deception. In his limited experience as a deputy, he'd learned that the people closest to missing persons often knew more than they initially let on. Family members and friends might withhold information to protect the missing person's reputation, or because they were ashamed of their own role in whatever had happened. Alice, is there anything else you can tell me about Emily's state of mind lately? Was she worried about anything? Did she mention feeling threatened or followed? Alice shook her head, but Raymond noticed that her hands were still trembling. Emily was ... Emily. She was always optimistic, always looking for the best in people. If she was worried about something, she kept it to herself. What about last night? Did she say anything about driving home after work? No, we didn't talk last night. I called the diner, but Frank said she was busy with customers. I was planning to call her at home later. But ... single quotes, Alice's voice trailed off, and fresh tears began to roll down her cheek. Raymond closed his notebook and handed Alice his business card. If you think of anything else, anything at all that might help us find Emily, please call me immediately, even if it seems unimportant. Alice nodded and took the card, but Raymond could tell she was holding something back. He'd seen that look before, the expression of someone who knew more than they were saying, but couldn't quite bring themselves to reveal it. Whatever secret Alice McKinney was keeping, Raymond suspected it was connected to Emily's disappearance. As he left the library, Raymond made a mental note to follow up with Alice in a day or two. Sometimes people needed time to process their guilt or fear before they could tell the whole truth. And in a case like this, where a young woman had simply vanished without a trace, every detail might be crucial. The afternoon brought more questions than answers. Emily's apartment on Maple Street revealed nothing unusual: clothes in the closet, food in the refrigerator, bills paid and neatly filed. Her landlady, Mrs. Patterson, described Emily as a model tenant who kept to herself, but was always polite and considerate. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication that Emily had been planning to leave town. But there were also things missing that should have been there. Emily's purse, for one, the brown leather bag that Frank Morrison said she always carried, her driver's license, credit cards, and whatever cash she might have had from tips were nowhere to be found. Neither were the shoes that matched the one found on Old Timber Road. Most puzzling of all was the lack of any evidence suggesting how Emily had ended up in Mill Creek. The car showed no signs of mechanical failure, no indication that she'd lost control due to the storm. The angle at which the Ford had entered the water suggested a deliberate turn rather than an accidental skid. As evening approached, and the search teams prepared to suspend their efforts until morning, Sheriff Bobby Ray Hudson stood beside Old Timber Road and tried to make sense of what they'd found and what they hadn't found. In 30 years of law enforcement, he'd worked dozens of traffic accidents, missing person cases, and unexplained incidents. But he'd never encountered anything quite like the disappearance of Emily Rhodes. The storm had washed away any physical evidence that might have explained what happened on Old Timber Road. But storms couldn't wash away the feeling that something was terribly wrong with the official version of events. Bobby Ray had learned to trust his instincts over the years. And tonight, those instincts were telling him that Emily Rhodes hadn't simply driven off the road in bad weather. Someone had wanted Emily to disappear. The question was, who and why? And whether they would ever find her alive to tell them the answer. As darkness fell over Laurel County on August 20th, 1981, the search for Emily Rhodes was officially suspended until dawn. But in the diners and gas stations, the churches and beauty parlors, the people of the county continued their own investigation, sharing theories and suspicions in the way that small communities always did when one of their own went missing. Most of them believed Emily was dead, though no one wanted to say it out loud. But a few, her friends, her family, the people who knew her best, held on to the hope that she was somewhere out there, waiting to be found. They would keep that hope alive for years to come, even as the days turned into months, and the months turned into decades. Because, in a place like Laurel County, Kentucky, some mysteries were too close to home to ever really let go. By the winter of 1982, the Emily Rhodes case had officially gone cold. The filing cabinet in Sheriff Bobby Ray Hudson's office contained 17 folders of witness statements, police reports, and dead-end leads. The FBI had been brought in for consultation after 3 months, but even their resources and expertise couldn't explain how a 27-year-old woman had simply vanished from a car that showed no signs of foul play. The theories had multiplied like weeds in the summer heat. Some believed Emily had staged her own disappearance, tired of small-town life, and ready for a fresh start somewhere far from Kentucky. Others insisted she'd been murdered, her body hidden so well that it might never be found. A few claimed she'd been picked up by a passing trucker and was living under a new identity in California or Florida or some other place where the past couldn't follow. But for the people who knew Emily best, none of these explanations felt right. Emily Rhodes wasn't the kind of person who abandoned her responsibilities or hurt the people who loved her. She wasn't reckless or impulsive. She was steady, reliable Emily, who always paid her bills on time and never forgot a birthday. The Emily they knew wouldn't have simply walked away from her life without a word. Frank Morrison kept her job open at the Blue Lantern Diner until Christmas of 1981, hanging on to the hope that she might walk through the door one morning with a reasonable explanation for where she'd been. When he finally hired someone else, he put Emily's nameplate in his desk drawer rather than throwing it away. Sometimes, late at night, when he was closing up the restaurant, he would take out that nameplate and wonder what had really happened on Old Timber Road. Alice McKinney left Laurel County in the spring of 1983, accepting a librarian position in Louisville that paid better and offered more opportunities for advancement. But those who knew her well suspected the real reason for her departure was the weight of whatever secret she'd been carrying since Emily's disappearance. Alice had grown increasingly withdrawn in the months following that terrible August night, declining invitations to social gatherings and avoiding the places where she and Emily had spent time together. Before she left town, Alice visited Emily's grave at Hillcrest Cemetery, the empty grave that Emily's parents had insisted on after the one-year anniversary of her disappearance. There was no body to bury, but the gravestone provided a place for grief to settle, a focal point for the community's need to believe that Emily Rhodes was at peace. Alice stood at that grave for almost an hour on a rainy April morning, speaking in whispers to a friend who wasn't there. A passing jogger later claimed he'd heard her say, "I'm sorry," over and over again. But Alice never confirmed what she'd been apologizing for. 3 days later, she was gone, leaving behind only a forwarding address and a request that no one from Laurel County contact her. The years passed with the slow, inexorable weight of unanswered questions. Sheriff Bobby Ray Hudson retired in 1987, turning the Emily Rhodes file over to his successor with the admission that it remained the one case he'd never been able to solve. Deputy Raymond Hurst, now a seasoned investigator, continued to follow up on occasional tips and reported sightings, but none ever led anywhere meaningful. Emily's parents, Harold and Margaret Rhodes, aged in the particular way that parents of missing children always do, not just the natural progression of time, but the deeper weathering that comes from hope, deferred, and questions that will never be answered. They kept Emily's childhood bedroom exactly as she'd left it, down to the horse figurines on her dresser and the high school prom photo on her nightstand. Every August 19th, they drove out to Old Timber Road and left flowers at the spot where Emily's car had been found. The Blue Lantern Diner changed hands twice during the 1980s, but Emily's story remained part of its folklore. New employees were always told about the waitress who'd disappeared on a stormy night, and regular customers would sometimes point out Table 7, where Emily had been working on her last shift. The story took on the qualities of a local legend, growing in detail and dramatic significance with each retelling. Teenagers began driving Old Timber Road on Friday nights, daring each other to stop at the curve where Emily's car had gone into the creek. They claimed you could sometimes hear the sound of a car engine in the distance, or see headlights that disappeared when you tried to follow them. The bravest ones would get out of their cars and walk down to the water's edge, looking for some sign of what had happened to Emily Rhodes. Most dismissed these stories as typical small-town ghost tales, the kind of spooky folklore that every community seemed to develop around its unsolved mysteries, but a few people reported experiences that were harder to explain away. In 1986, a traveling salesman called the sheriff's department to report that he'd seen a young woman walking along Old Timber Road late at night, wearing what looked like a waitress uniform. When he'd stopped to offer help, the woman had vanished into the trees. 3 years later, a couple from Cincinnati, who'd stopped at the Blue Lantern for dinner, claimed that their waitress had looked exactly like the missing woman in the newspaper clipping posted near the cash register. The manager assured them it was impossible. The woman serving their food was named Linda and had been working there for 6 months, but the couple insisted they'd heard her humming the same song that was playing on the jukebox the night Emily disappeared, Patsy Cline's Sweet Dreams. The most disturbing report came in 1992, when a Kentucky State Police trooper, responding to a minor accident near Mill Creek, found a woman's high-heeled shoe on the bank where Emily's car had been discovered 11 years earlier. The shoe was black leather, size 7, and appeared to be relatively new, despite being partially buried in the mud. It was the right shoe mate to the left one that had been found the morning after Emily's disappearance. But when the trooper returned the next day with a metal detector and a more thorough search team, they found nothing else. The shoe was sent to the state crime lab for analysis, but no useful evidence could be extracted from it. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. Had someone been placing shoes at the site as some kind of sick joke? Was it evidence that Emily's body was buried somewhere nearby? Or was it simply a coincidence, another woman's shoe, that happened to match the one from 1981? The case file grew thicker with each reported sighting and strange discovery, but the essential mystery remained unchanged. Emily Rhodes had driven down Old Timber Road on a stormy night in August 1981 and had never been seen again. Her car had been found in Mill Creek with no signs of an accident, no evidence of foul play, and no explanation for how she had simply disappeared. As the 1990s progressed, and Laurel County began to modernize new businesses, better roads, cellular phone towers that brought the outside world closer, Millie's story started to feel like a relic from an earlier time. Younger residents knew the basic facts, but they lacked the emotional connection to the case that their parents and grandparents carried. Emily Rhodes was becoming history rather than memory, a cautionary tale about the dangers of driving alone at night, rather than a real person who had lived and worked and laughed among them. But for those who had known Emily personally, time could not diminish the reality of her absence. Frank Morrison, now in his 70s and struggling with the early stages of dementia, would sometimes call out Emily's name during the dinner rush at whatever restaurant he happened to be visiting. Her parents continued their annual pilgrimage to Old Timber Road, though Harold's arthritis made it harder for him to walk down to the creek, and Margaret's eyesight was failing to the point where she could barely see the flowers she left. The most faithful keeper of Emily's memory was Deputy Raymond Hurst, who had been promoted to detective in 1994 and made Emily's case his personal mission. Every few months, he would drive out to Old Timber Road and walk the area where her car had been found, looking for anything that previous searchers might have missed. He interviewed and re-interviewed everyone who had known Emily, hoping that time might have loosened someone's tongue or clarified a forgotten detail. It was Raymond who noticed that the blue pickup truck mentioned in the original police reports had never been identified. Several witnesses had seen a blue truck at the Blue Lantern Diner on the night of Emily's disappearance, but despite extensive efforts, police had never been able to track down the owner. The truck seemed to have appeared and disappeared as mysteriously as Emily herself. In 1998, Raymond received a call from a woman in Tennessee who claimed her ex-husband had once bragged about taking care of a problem in Kentucky back in 1981. The man drove a blue pickup truck and had worked construction jobs throughout the region during the early 1980s. But when Raymond tracked down the ex-husband, the man had died 3 years earlier in a workplace accident, taking any secrets he might have known to his grave. The call from Tennessee represented the last serious lead in the Emily Rhodes case. As the 20th anniversary of her disappearance approached, Detective Raymond Hurst prepared a comprehensive review of the case file, hoping that fresh eyes and modern investigative techniques might reveal something that had been overlooked. DNA analysis, computer databases, and improved forensic science had revolutionized criminal investigation since 1981, but they could only work with physical evidence, and Emily's case had precious little of that. The 20-year anniversary brought renewed media attention to the story. The Louisville Courier-Journal ran a feature article about unsolved cases in Kentucky, with Emily's disappearance prominently featured. A local television station produced a 10-minute segment that aired on the evening news, complete with interviews with Harold and Margaret Rhodes and Detective Raymond Hurst. The renewed publicity generated dozens of calls to the sheriff's department, but most were from well-meaning people who thought they might have seen Emily somewhere over the years, or from amateur investigators who had theories about what might have happened. A few calls were from cranks and attention seekers who confessed to crimes they clearly hadn't committed. None provided any useful information, but one call was different. On August 23, 2001, 4 days after the 20th anniversary of Emily's disappearance, Detective Raymond Hurst received a phone call from a woman who identified herself only as someone who knew Emily. The woman's voice was older, strained, and she seemed to be fighting back tears as she spoke. "I saw the story on television," the woman said. "About Emily Rhodes, I think. I think I know what happened to her." Raymond grabbed a pen and prepared to take notes, but the woman's next words stopped him cold. "But I can't tell you now. Not over the phone. Meet me at the Blue Lantern Diner tomorrow at noon. Come alone, and don't tell anyone else about this call. If you do, you'll never hear from me again." The line went dead before Raymond could ask any questions. For the first time in 20 years, Detective Raymond Hurst allowed himself to hope that the Emily Rhodes case might finally be solved. But as he sat in his office staring at the phone, he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever he learned at the Blue Lantern Diner might be more complicated and more disturbing than anything he had imagined. The ghosts of Laurel County were about to speak, and Detective Raymond Hurst wasn't sure he was ready to hear what they had to say. Detective Raymond Hurst arrived at the Blue Lantern Diner 15 minutes early on August 24, 2001, choosing a corner booth that gave him a clear view of both the front door and the parking lot. The lunch crowd was typical for a Thursday: construction workers, retirees, and a few traveling salesmen who'd stopped for the daily special. Raymond ordered coffee and tried to look casual, while his mind raced with possibilities about who might walk through that door. At exactly noon, Alice McKinney entered the Blue Lantern Diner for the first time in 18 years. Raymond recognized her immediately, despite the changes that 2 decades had brought. Her brown hair was now streaked with gray and cut shorter than he remembered, and lines around her eyes spoke of years of worry and sleepless nights. She wore a simple blue dress and carried a small purse, clutched tightly in both hands, her knuckles white with tension. Alice scanned the restaurant until she spotted Raymond, then walked directly to his booth without making eye contact with anyone else. She slid into the seat across from him and immediately began speaking in a voice barely above a whisper. "I saw the anniversary story on television. I've been thinking about calling for 20 years, but I couldn't." Her hands were shaking as she set her purse on the table. "I need to tell you what really happened that night. What I should have told you 20 years ago." Raymond leaned forward, keeping his voice calm and professional despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Take your time, Alice. Start wherever you feel comfortable." Alice closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering courage from some deep reservoir. When she opened them again, Raymond could see they were filled with tears that had been waiting 20 years to fall. "Emily was pregnant," Alice said. "She found out 3 weeks before she disappeared. She was terrified, confused, and she didn't know what to do." The words hit Raymond like a physical blow. In 20 years of investigating Emily's disappearance, pregnancy had never come up as a possibility. There had been no medical records indicating she was seeing a doctor for prenatal care, no prescription medications in her apartment, no physical evidence in the car or anywhere else. "The father," Raymond said carefully. "Do you know who it was?" Alice nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "That's why I couldn't tell you before. That's why Emily was so secretive about the relationship. The father was married, prominent in the community. Emily was protecting him, and after she disappeared, I was protecting his family." "Who was it, Alice?" Alice reached into her purse and pulled out a small envelope, yellowed with age. "Before I tell you, you need to understand something. Emily wasn't having an affair by choice. She was young, vulnerable, and he took advantage of that. She thought she loved him, but looking back, I can see he was manipulating her." Single quotes. Raymond accepted the envelope and carefully opened it. Inside was a single photographer Polaroid picture of Emily sitting at a picnic table, laughing at something off camera. But what made Raymond's stomach clench was the man sitting next to her, his arm around her shoulders. It was Sheriff Bobby Ray Hudson, 20 years younger, but unmistakably recognizable. "Jesus Christ," Raymond whispered. Emily was going to tell his wife. Alice continued. She'd made up her mind. The pregnancy forced her hand. She couldn't keep the secret anymore. She was planning to call Mrs. Hudson the morning after her last shift at the diner. Raymond stared at the photograph, his mind reeling. Bobby Ray Hudson had been the lead investigator on Emily's case. He'd directed the search efforts, interviewed witnesses, and maintained the official case file for 6 years until his retirement. The idea that he'd been personally involved with Emily, that he might have had motive to silence her, turned everything Raymond thought he knew about the case upside down. "The argument you and Emily had," Raymond said. It was about this, Alice nodded. I begged her not to call Mrs. Hudson. I told her it would destroy their family, that Bobby Ray would deny everything, and Emily would be the one who suffered. I said terrible things about her judgment, about how naive she was being. We both said things we couldn't take back. And that's why you called the diner that night, to apologize. Yes, but also to warn her. After I calmed down, I realized Emily was in real danger. Bobby Ray had too much to lose: his career, his marriage, his reputation in the community. I was afraid of what he might do if he found out Emily was going to expose him. Raymond felt sick to his stomach. Did Emily tell Bobby Ray about the pregnancy? She called him that afternoon, before her shift. She told him she needed to see him, that they had to talk about something important. He said he would meet her after she got off work. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with horrible clarity. Bobby Ray Hudson had known Emily was going to leave the diner around 9:30. He could have been waiting for her in that blue pickup truck that no one had ever been able to identify, waiting to convince her to keep quiet, or to make sure she never had the chance to speak. Alice, why didn't you call the police when Emily disappeared? If you suspected Bobby Ray was involved, who was I going to call? Alice's voice rose slightly. Then she caught herself and lowered it again. Bobby Ray was the police. He was running the investigation. Anyone I talked to would have reported back to him. And I had no proof of anything except this photograph, which only showed they knew each other. Raymond studied the Polaroid more closely. The background showed a wooded area that looked familiar, though he couldn't immediately place it. Emily and Bobby Ray were both smiling, and there was an intimacy to their body language that spoke of a relationship that had been going on for some time. How long had this been going on? About 6 months, I think. Emily was very secretive about it at first. She just said she was seeing someone older, someone who understood her in ways that boys her own age didn't. It wasn't until later that she told me who it was. And you're certain she was pregnant? Alice reached into her purse again and pulled out a second item, a small piece of paper that Raymond recognized as a receipt from a drugstore. The date was August 3rd, 1981, and it showed the purchase of an at-home pregnancy test. She came to my apartment that Sunday afternoon, crying. The test was positive. She said she'd been feeling sick for weeks, but had been too scared to find out for sure. Raymond made notes on everything Alice was telling him, but his mind was racing ahead to the implications. If Emily had been pregnant with Bobby Ray Hudson's child, and if she had been planning to expose their relationship, then the former sheriff had powerful motives for murder. But proving it after 20 years would be nearly impossible. Alice, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Do you think Bobby Ray killed Emily? Alice was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the parking lot, where Emily's Ford Galaxy used to sit on break shifts. When she finally spoke, her voice was hollow and tired. I don't know. Part of me wants to believe he just convinced her to leave town, to start over somewhere else where the baby could be born without scandal. But Emily would never have left without telling me. She would never have put her parents through the agony of not knowing what happened to her. What about the car in the creek? If Bobby Ray was involved, how do you explain that? I've thought about that for 20 years, Alice said. Bobby Ray was smart, experienced. He would have known that Emily's disappearance needed to look like an accident or a random crime. Staging the car crash would have given him cover to control the investigation, to make sure it never led back to him. Raymond closed his notebook and leaned back in the booth, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Alice had just revealed. Why now? Why are you telling me this after all these years? Because I'm dying, Alice said simply. Pancreatic cancer. The doctors say I have maybe 6 months. I can't take this secret to my grave. Emily deserves better than that. The confession hung in the air between them like smoke. Raymond felt the weight of 20 years of misdirected investigation, 20 years of Emily's family not knowing the truth about what had happened to their daughter. If Alice was right, then Bobby Ray Hudson had not only gotten away with murder, he'd been celebrated as a dedicated lawman who'd done everything possible to solve the case. There's something else, Alice said, reaching into her purse one final time. Emily kept a diary. She hid it in her apartment, in a place where she thought no one would ever find it. I went there after she disappeared, before the police searched the place. I took it. She handed Raymond a small, leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. Everything is in there. The whole relationship, the pregnancy, her plans to tell Mrs. Hudson. If you need proof of what I'm telling you, It's all in Emily's own words. Raymond accepted the diary with shaking hands. This was the evidence that could finally solve the Emily Rhodes case or destroy the reputation of a man who was now 73 years old and living quietly in retirement. Alice, I have to ask, you prepared to go on record with this information? To testify if necessary. Alice smiled sadly. Detective, I'm prepared to do whatever it takes to get Emily the justice she deserves. I've been a coward for 20 years. I don't want to die being a coward. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of Alice's revelation settling over them like a heavy blanket. Finally, Raymond asked the question that had been nagging at him since Alice walked through the door. How did you know to call me specifically? Why did you trust me with this? Because you never gave up on her, Alice said. All these years, you kept trying to find the truth. Emily would have appreciated that. She believed in justice, in doing the right thing, even when it was hard. That's why she was going to tell Mrs. Hudson about the affair, because keeping the secret was eating her alive. Alice stood up from the booth, leaving $20 on the table to cover Raymond's coffee and her untouched water. There's one more thing you should know. The blue pickup truck that people saw at the diner that night, Bobby Ray's brother-in-law owned one just like it. I don't know if that means anything, but Emily mentioned seeing a truck following her home from work a few times in the weeks before she disappeared. Can you identify the brother-in-law? Carl Hensley. He died in 1995, but his widow might still be alive. She lived over in Corbin last I heard. With that, Alice McKinney walked out of the Blue Lantern Diner for the second time in her life, leaving Detective Raymond Hurst alone with a diary, a photograph, and the most significant break in the Emily Rhodes case in 20 years. As Raymond sat in the booth where Emily had served her last customers, he felt the strange sensation of time collapsing. The young deputy who had responded to John Whitfield's call in 1981 had become the experienced detective who might finally be able to give Emily Rhodes the justice she deserved. But he also knew that proving Bobby Ray Hudson's guilt would be the most difficult and dangerous investigation of his career. Some truths, Raymond realized, were more complicated than justice. Some secrets had been buried so long that digging them up might destroy innocent people along with the guilty. But as he opened Emily's diary and began to read her own words about the relationship that had ultimately cost her life, Raymond knew he had no choice but to follow the evidence wherever it led. Emily Rhodes had been silenced once. Detective Raymond Hurst was determined to make sure she would never be silenced again. Detective Raymond Hurst spent 3 sleepless nights reading Emily Rhodes' diary. Her handwriting was small and precise, filling page after page with the intimate details of a relationship that had started, innocently enough, and gradually become something darker and more complicated than a young woman could handle alone. The early entries from February 1981 described chance encounters with Sheriff Hudson at the diner, how he would linger over coffee and ask her about her dreams for the future. Emily had been flattered by the attention of an older, respected man who seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and opinion. The progression from friendly conversation to secret meetings happened gradually, documented in Emily's increasingly conflicted words. March 15, 1981, Bobby Ray says his marriage has been over 4 years, that he and Linda are only staying together for appearances. He makes me feel like I'm the only person who really understands him. Is it wrong that I look forward to our talks more than anything else in my day? April 22, 1981, we met at the old Miller farm again today. Bobby Ray brought a picnic lunch, and we talked for hours about everything and nothing. He took a picture of us with his camera. I told him he should be careful about that, but he said he wanted something to remember me by, when we can't see each other anymore. I don't like it when he talks about ending things. July 8, 1981, something has changed between us. Bobby Ray seems more possessive now, more demanding. He gets angry when I mention other men, even customers at the diner, who are just being friendly. Yesterday, he drove by the diner 3 times during my shift, just watching. Alice says I should be careful, that married men like him only care about themselves. August 3, 1981, I took the test today. Positive? I've been sick every morning for 2 weeks. But I kept telling myself it was just stress from work. How could I have been so stupid? How could I have believed him when he said, we were careful enough? I don't know what to do. I can't keep this secret, but telling the truth will destroy so many lives. August 16, 1981. I called Bobby Ray today and told him we need to talk. I didn't tell him about the baby over the phone, but I think he knows something is wrong. He sounded different, cold. When I said I couldn't keep our relationship secret anymore, he got very quiet. Then he said we would discuss it after my shift on Tuesday. He said some things are better handled in person. There was something in his voice that scared me. The final entry was dated August 19th, 1981, the day Emily disappeared. I'm working the dinner shift tonight, and then I'm supposed to meet Bobby Ray on Old Timber Road after I get off. I'm going to tell him about the baby and about my decision to tell Linda everything. I know he'll be angry, but this has gone on long enough. I can't raise a child built on lies and secrets. Alice thinks I'm making a mistake, but I have to do what's right. If Bobby Ray really loves me the way he says he does, he'll understand. If he doesn't, then I'll know what kind of man he really is. I keep thinking about what my mother would say if she knew what I've gotten myself into. She always told me that the truth has a way of coming out eventually, and that it's better to face it head on than to let it fester in the dark. I hope she's right. I hope that after tonight, I can finally start building an honest life for me and my baby. Raymond closed the diary and sat back in his home office chair, feeling the full weight of Emily's story settling on his shoulders. The young woman who had disappeared 20 years ago wasn't just a victim, she was a person who had made difficult choices under impossible circumstances, trying to navigate a relationship with a man who held all the power while she had none. The diary provided compelling evidence of motive, but Raymond knew it wouldn't be enough to bring charges against Bobby Ray Hudson after 20 years. He needed more physical evidence, witness testimony, something that could corroborate Emily's account and prove that the former sheriff had been involved in her disappearance. Over the next 2 weeks, Raymond quietly began reinvestigating the case from a completely different angle. He drove to Corbin and interviewed Carl Hensley's widow, who confirmed that her late husband had owned a blue Chevrolet pickup truck in 1981. She also mentioned that Bobby Ray had borrowed the truck on several occasions when his patrol car was being serviced, including at least once in August of that year. Raymond tracked down Linda Hudson, the former sheriff's ex-wife, who had remarried and moved to Florida after their divorce in 1989. Over the phone, she admitted that her marriage to Bobby Ray had been troubled for years before Emily's disappearance, but she insisted she had never suspected him of having an affair. Bobby Ray was always working late, always had some case that required his attention, Linda told Raymond. I thought he was just dedicated to his job. Looking back, I suppose there were signs, but I chose not to see them. When Raymond asked if she remembered anything unusual about her husband's behavior in August 1981, Linda was quiet for a long moment. He was different after that girl disappeared. She finally said, more distant, more irritable. He started drinking more, too. I thought it was just the stress of the investigation, but maybe there was more to it than that. The most significant break came when Raymond decided to re-examine the physical evidence from the original investigation. The single high-heeled shoe found near Emily's car had been stored in the evidence room for 20 years, along with various items recovered from the Ford Galaxy. Modern DNA testing techniques hadn't existed in 1981, but they might be able to extract useful information from evidence that had been overlooked at the time. Raymond submitted the shoe for advanced forensic analysis, along with several other items from Emily's car. 2 weeks later, the lab results provided a stunning revelation. Microscopic fibers found on the shoe matched the interior fabric of a 1978 Chevrolet pickup truck, the same make and model that Carl Hensley had owned. More importantly, the lab had been able to extract a partial DNA profile from skin cells found inside the shoe. The profile was incomplete, too degraded by time and exposure to be used for a definitive match, but it was enough to exclude Emily as the source. Someone else had handled that shoe, and that someone had been male. Armed with this new evidence, Raymond made the most difficult decision of his career. On September 15, 2001, he drove to Bobby Ray Hudson's retirement home on the outskirts of Laurel County to confront the man who had once been his boss and mentor. Bobby Ray answered the door himself, looking older and frailer than Raymond remembered. At 73, the former sheriff moved slowly and used a walking cane, but his eyes were still sharp and alert. He invited Raymond into his living room, offering coffee and small talk about mutual acquaintances. "What can I do for you, Raymond?" Bobby Ray asked, as they settled into comfortable chairs. "It's not often I get visits from active duty investigators." Raymond opened his briefcase and placed Emily's diary on the coffee table between them. "I'm here about the Emily Rhodes case. I have new information that changes everything we thought we knew about her disappearance." Bobby Ray glanced at the diary but showed no visible reaction. That case was thoroughly investigated. If you found something new, I hope it finally gives the family some closure. I think it will, Raymond said, but not in the way they were expecting. For the next hour, Raymond laid out everything he had learned from Alice McKinney, everything he had read in Emily's diary, and all the new forensic evidence that connected Bobby Ray to Emily's disappearance. He watched the former sheriff's face carefully, looking for any sign of guilt or confession. Bobby Ray listened without interruption, his expression never changing. When Raymond finished, the old man was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at his well-maintained garden. "That's quite a story," Bobby Ray finally said. "A lot of speculation and coincidence, but not much in the way of proof. The DNA evidence places you at the scene. Emily's diary documents your relationship and your meeting on the night she disappeared. Your brother-in-law's truck matches the fibers found on Emily's shoe. Carl let a lot of people borrow that truck. As for DNA, well, I was the investigating officer. Of course, my DNA might be present at the scene. I spent hours there, processing evidence." Raymond leaned forward in his chair. "Bobby Ray, I've known you for over 20 years. I've respected you, learned from you, considered you a mentor. But Emily Rhodes deserves justice, and her family deserves the truth. If you were involved in her disappearance, now is the time to tell me." Bobby Ray Hudson looked directly at Raymond for the first time since the conversation began. In his eyes, Raymond saw something he had never seen before. Not guilt, exactly, but a kind of weary resignation that spoke of secrets carried too long. "You know what the worst part of getting old is, Raymond? It's not the failing body or the fading memory. It's the weight of all the choices you made when you were younger, when you thought you could control everything and everyone around you." The admission hung in the air between them like smoke. Raymond held his breath, sensing that Bobby Ray was on the verge of saying something that would change both their lives forever. Emily Rhodes was a beautiful, intelligent young woman who deserved better than what happened to her, Bobby Ray continued. But she was also naive and stubborn, and she refused to understand that some truths are too dangerous to speak. "What happened that night, Bobby Ray?" The former sheriff stood up slowly and walked to his front window, looking out at the peaceful street where he had lived quietly for more than a decade. "I met her on Old Timber Road, just like she asked. I tried to reason with her, to make her understand what telling Linda would do to my family, to my career. But Emily had made up her mind. And then she told me about the baby. Said it was mine. Said she was going to have it whether I helped her or not. Said the child deserved to know its father." Bobby Ray's voice was barely above a whisper now. "I panicked. 26 years of building a life, a reputation, a career, all of it about to be destroyed by a girl who thought she was doing the right thing." Raymond felt his heart pounding as the confession he had waited 20 years to hear finally emerged. "Did you kill her, Bobby Ray?" "I never meant for it to happen the way it did. We argued in my brother-in-law's truck, and Emily said she was leaving, going home to call Linda that night. I grabbed her arm to stop her, and she pulled away. Lost her balance, hit her head on the doorframe. When she fell, she wasn't moving anymore." The words seemed to drain all the energy from Bobby Ray's body. He slumped against the window, looking every one of his 73 years. "I checked for a pulse, tried to wake her up, but she was gone. Just like that. One moment she was arguing with me, the next she was ... gone. I sat there for I don't know how long, trying to figure out what to do." "So you staged the accident?" Bobby Ray nodded. "Put her back in her car, drove it to the creek, made it look like she'd lost control in the storm, threw her shoe in the woods to make it seem like she'd been thrown from the vehicle. Then I called in the case the next morning. Acted surprised when John Whitfield found the car. What did you do with Emily's body?" "There's an old mine shaft about 10 miles north of here. Been sealed up since the 1950s. I put her there, said a prayer for her soul, and asked God to forgive me for what I'd done." Raymond closed his eyes, feeling a mixture of relief and revulsion. After 20 years, he finally knew what had happened to Emily Rhodes. But the knowledge came with the devastating realization that the man he had looked up to and respected was responsible for one of the most heinous crimes he could imagine. "Bobby Ray Hudson," Raymond said, standing up and reaching for his handcuffs. "You're under arrest for the murder of Emily Rhodes." The former sheriff didn't resist as Raymond read him his rights. As they walked to the patrol car, Bobby Ray spoke one last time. "I've lived with what I did for 20 years, Raymond. Not a day has gone by that I haven't thought about Emily, about the life she should have had, about the child that never got to be born. I know it doesn't change anything, but I am truly sorry for what I did. Bobby Ray Hudson was convicted of voluntary manslaughter in the death of Emily Rhodes and sentenced to 12 years in prison. At his age and health, it was essentially a life sentence. He died in prison 2 years later, taking any remaining secrets to his grave. Emily's remains were recovered from the mine shaft and finally laid to rest in Hillcrest Cemetery, next to the empty grave that had waited for her for 22 years. Her parents, Harold and Margaret Rhodes, attended the funeral, along with dozens of community members who had never forgotten the young waitress who had simply wanted to do the right thing. Alice McKinney lived long enough to see Bobby Ray's conviction before succumbing to cancer in the spring of 2002. Her final act was to establish a scholarship fund in Emily's name for young women pursuing careers in education or social work fields, where doing the right thing was more important than personal gain. The Blue Lantern Diner changed its name to Emily's Place in 2003, honoring the memory of the waitress who had served her last meal there on a stormy night in August 1981. Table 7, where Emily had worked her final shift, bears a small brass plaque with her name and the words "in memory of those who speak truth with courage." Detective Raymond Hurst retired from the Laurel County Sheriff's Department in 2005, having finally solved the case that had defined his career. He still drives out to Old Timber Road sometimes, especially on stormy nights in August, and thinks about the young woman whose voice was silenced for 20 years, but who ultimately found the justice she deserved. The Emily Rhodes case remains a reminder that truth has its own timeline, and that secrets buried in small-town soil have a way of working their way to the surface, eventually. In the hills of Kentucky, where memory runs deep and grudges run deeper, some stories refuse to stay buried forever. Sometimes justice arrives slowly, like water wearing a waystone, but it arrives nonetheless, carrying with it the voices of those who can no longer speak for themselves. Emily Rhodes finally came home.